All right. Good afternoon. No, can I say that already? Everyone, and welcome to you all for joining for our next seminar in the bioethics seminar series. So today we have a special guest from Italy with us, a familiar face for some of us that were here already a few years ago. So Dr. Davide Battisti will provide a book presentation on his first book. So Dr. Battisti is a postdoctoral researcher in philosophy of law and bioethics at the Department of Law of the University of Bergamo. He also serves as an adjunct professor of bioethics in the politics, philosophy and public affairs program at the University of Milan and the Vita Salute San Raffaele University. He has published several papers on topics such as reproductive ethics, the allocation of scarce healthcare resources, ethics of AI's impact on human relationships, the ethics of science communication, and research ethics. And today, like I said, he will present his first book on procreative responsibility and assisted reproductive technologies. So I invite everyone to listen carefully and also to ask questions afterwards during the discussion. The whole idea is also to interact and to help each other forward with new research ideas also, I think. So I now giving you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Eva, for making everything possible together with Silvia. I'm very happy and moved to be here because, as Eva says, I've been here 4 or 5 years ago as a visiting PhD student under the supervision of Pascal. I remember that moment with very huge love and gratitude because it was one of the best periods in my life, I have to say. And in that period, I started thinking about the project that I will discuss with you now. And then, after development, come up with this book that has been published basically some months ago in July 2024. And so today I'm going to just tell you something about this book and something about what are the research questions I care more and what are the insights that could be found in this monograph. But first, let me start from the aims, the assumption, and the premises of this project. Because, bioethics can be done in different ways. There are empirical bioethics, there are, policy-based bioethics, and I am, as a philosopher, want to discuss more from a conceptual and in principle point of view. So I just warning that this talk gonna be very theoretical. And so I'm so sorry if you cannot find some, direct implication in my talk. My aim here is reviewing the major argument in the philosophical-driven bioethical literature and introduce new ones concerning a fundamental moral question, that is, what do we owe to future children in light of current and future assisted reproductive technologies. In order to approach this question, I adopt a peculiar approach that can be called pragmatic optimism, provided by Agar in his famous book Liberal Eugenics in 2004. So this means that I assume that the techniques I will mention shortly will be effective, available, and accessible, both current and future technologies. Someone could question what is the need to think about ethics when there is no possibility, no practical, no technological possibility to do some result, to deliver some result. Well, I would like to provide, or I would like to contribute in providing what has been called moral insurance. So it's better to have principles to address situations that may prove impossible. So at the end of the day, my work would be, useless. Just joking. than to lack principles for situations in which we suddenly find ourselves. So, in order to do that, there is the need not only to assume the technological possibility and feasibility, but also assuming a liberal legal framework, the broadest one, in order to assess the moral responsibility. Because if you can consider in the Kantian fashion, right, moral responsibility, the moral law can be discovered only in a realm of autonomy and liberty. Okay? Nevertheless, the real-world context is far more complex and should be carefully examined for an all things considered evaluation. My considerations are not all things considered, but we can call this prima facie consideration. But what about the technology that I'm going to mention? Well, you may be, a lot of us, maybe because of your project that very interesting, I heard now a little bit, they are quite familiar with this kind of technologies. I will mention basically 4 technologies. So in vitro fertilization, so the possibility of artificial fertilization of an oocyte, followed by with the sperm, of course, followed by the transfer of the resulting embryo into the uterus. Then you know that we have the possibility in capsula petri in vitro to deliver also the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. There is an auxiliary procedure that allows the identification of specific genetic characteristics in early embryos obtained in vitro before uterine transferring. It can be used for avoiding disease and disability, sex selection, selecting for disability, so selecting in order to search for some trait or some that can be considered from some people a disability or non-pathologic traits. You know, there are a lot of clinics in Ukraine and Mexico that promises that we can select, you know, the eye color or the hair color of the future baby. I use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. I'm aware that nowadays we have to call it pre-implantation genetic testing. However, since the bioethical debate mostly refer on PGD, I just decided to keep this kind of label. Of course, we can change it. I don't think that this can compromise my argument. Then we have the future technologies. Maybe also that's something that we will be able to see in some years, such as reproductive genome editing. It's already, you know, done something like that in 2018 in China. The He and Kui Chinese scientist, you know, modified 2 embryos in order to, and then transfer the embryos into the uterus and giving birth to Chinese twins with a DNA more resistant to HIV, Lulu and Nana. But of course, there are a lot of problematic aspects in that research and the way in which that research has been delivered. So nowadays, we don't have this kind of clinical application of this kind of technologies, because some people believe that these kind of technologies that will be useful in the first times for monogenic disease and maybe in the future for polygenic disease. Now, I saw that there are some, in a new newsletter I saw yesterday, there was some research in order to try to even modify an entire chromosome to avoid, for instance, Down syndrome, okay? But, you know, it's something like a very, we are discussing about future nowadays. And of course, I will refer also about ectogenesis, so that can be referred in both partial and total possibility of having a, gestation, extrauterine gestation, so outside of the womb of the mother. Of course, about the total, maybe is not even technologically possible, but maybe this will be possible in 100 years. I don't know, actually. There are a lot of promising studies in Philadelphia. But yeah, assuming that we have this kind of possibility, okay? So, assuming this kind of possibility, so the possibility of very effective in vitro fertilization, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and the possibility of having this kind of reproductive genetic genome editing and ectogenesis, now we have to understand, we have to explore the possibility of changing some of our concepts that we use in our ordinary way to refer about morality of parenthood and procreation. So, So, of course, this kind of technology, on the one hand, enhance procreative autonomy. And this has been the aspect most studied, in my opinion, in the bioethical debate, in the bioethical reflection. Indeed, a significant part of the bioethical debate has been focused on whether or not we can use this kind of assisted reproductive technologies, if we can permit or not this, and if so, how to appropriately regulate this. However, on the other hand, this technique shows the necessity of rethinking procreative responsibility as well. There is a very, superficial argument that we can explore further, but there is some, insight, some reasoned intuition that allows us to do this kind of reflection. There is the fact that many procreative facts no longer occur in the field, in the realm of nature, but fall within the field of what we can control, what we can take care of it. As our technical powers increase, the territory of the natural is annexed to the social realm. We are inaugurating here what has been called a colonization of reproduction by, according to Buchanan justice, but I would like to use a broader reflection, by ethics. And in line with this, some argue that parents would encounter not only a greater procreative autonomy in a technical way, we have more options, right? But also new moral obligation. These kind of authors discuss this kind of obligation already in the current context. So what can be called selective context of, if you want, IVF plus PGD, so the fact of selecting embryos. And different models of procreative responsibility has been proposed. In order to understand this kind of literature, I would like to propose you a thought experiment, or basically a hypothetical case. So avoiding all the, referring to the notion of disability, all things considered. We know that disability is a very complex concept, it's very difficult to define it, but here I'm more concerned on the conceptual possibility of using some concepts such as procreative responsibility. And in order to do that, I ask you to consider the following case. A couple decide to use IVF and PGD to have a child, resulting in the creation of several embryos with different characteristics. So we have here 3 embryos. The first one, the embryo carries a condition, M, which could lead to certain disabilities in the future, but compatible with a life worth living. Okay? So a life, of course, that we can consider the carrier something like a person with disability, but something that, all things considered, is worth living. Embryo B, this embryo does not carry condition M, that's it, we don't know any other characteristic of embryo B. And embryo C. This embryo is free, in the same way of embryo B, from condition M, but at the same time has a genetic variant associated with higher intelligence. We nowadays have some evidence that some, at least, genetic characteristics can be linked to some, way of characterial traits or intelligence, and so on and so forth. But please, again, recall the pragmatic optimism here. So, the question here, does the couple have a moral obligation, and not just a preference, to make a specific choice? Is there any more reason to prefer embryo B or C over embryo A? Someone could say we have. But I would like to go further here. Do we have more reason even to create embryo, to transfer embryo C over embryo B and embryo A? So selecting the most intelligent one, okay? Put in bracket all the technical hardnesses here. Well, according to someone, yes, we not only have the obligation to avoid selecting an embryo who will result in a child with some disability, but even we have an obligation to do something further. A well-known response to this question is indeed offered by the principle of procreative beneficence provided by Julian Savulescu. According to this, if couples have decided to have a child and selection, PGD plus IVF plus PGD, is possible, they have a substantial moral reason to choose the child from among the possible children they could have, whose life can be expected, based on the relevant available information, to go best, or at least no worse than any of the alternative. So, in the case described above, not only to avoid selecting embryo A, but actively selecting embryo C, since we should aim to select the child with more expected well-being. So, parents should be guided by the concern parents should have for the well-being of their future children. So, of course, this kind of models has been criticized a variety of times from different kind of perspective. For instance, according to someone, principle of procreative beneficence leads to eugenics. Principle of procreative beneficence, again, implies maybe a negative judgment toward people with disability. This is a famous expressivist critique that can be considered more effective in argument like that compared to maybe something like letting just the possibility of people to screening their embryos in a liberal framework. According to other people, says, well, it is impossible to define the most advantaged child or the best possible life, because life or well-being cannot be considered only as superimposable of our genetic condition and our health. There is the famous the inseparability problem here about the defining of health. Others could say, well, it's too demanding, because this kind of principle is a maximizing principle. Because we cannot only choose among the possible embryo without some, bad condition, but we should maximize the well-being of the future children. So there is some maximization here. Someone could recall the utilitarian framework behind this kind of principle. But here I would like to focus more on another aspect, very important, still compatible with some utilitarian consideration. That is the fact that some authors criticize this principle specifically for its impersonal nature. But what does it mean, impersonal? Well, basically, we can sum up this kind of definition or defining impersonality like what is important is not just choosing well-being, but, or is choosing well-being regardless the identity. With the selection of embryo C, we are not only determining the quality of life of the future child, but also its numerical identity. The concept of numerical identity I use here is distinct from qualitative identity. One object is qualitative identity identical to another when they are exactly alike. Essentially, one is a replica of another. Think about two bottles of water produced in series, right? So they are alike, completely alike, but they are not numerical identity, because two objects cannot be numerical identity, as referring to one or the other does not refer to the single identical object. Numerical identity is the relation things has only with itself. Okay? And of course, there is some necessary condition to look at and to define and to assess the numerical identity. One of these kind of necessary conditions in the context we are discussing about is what has been called the origin view. Here we assume that the encounter between a specific sperm cell and an oocyte is a necessary condition for the future individual's numerical identity. I cannot be my sister, because my sister is a different union between a different sperm and different oocyte. Okay? If we define numerical identity in this way, it becomes difficult to benefit or harm the future individual. Why? Well, because harm and benefit are comparative notions. A person, P, can be said to be benefit by an action X when the absence of X would have led to a state of affair in which P would have been worse off. If I give you a lot of money, I am benefiting you because it could have been worse without my money, right? Thus, however, in order to have this kind of comparison, we need to compare these two possible words in which the subject, the individual, you, okay, exist. So, P undergoing X, P not undergoing X, okay? Pascal with my money, Pascal without my money. I have not so much money, I'm so sorry. In the same thing can be said for the harm. A person, P, can be said to be harmed by an action X when the absence of X would have led to a state of affairs in which P would have been better off. Although many people have the intuition that we benefit the resulting child from choosing embryo C, because we are producing the best possible child, right? This is not possible to benefit the future child. The condition in which they exist is the only one in which they could ever exist. So, the condition, the high intelligence, is the necessary condition. And of course, if you look at this in the context of harm, think about the context of, choosing an embryo with some disease, right? Some deafness, for instance. Deafness in this context is become the necessary condition for their existence. So there is no comparison between A and B, okay, between two possible words. And this is basically the well-known non-identity problem, systematized, discovered independently by a variety of philosophers at the end of the 70s, but systematized at the great Derek Parfit. So, if we consider PPB, so the principle of procreative beneficence, as an impersonal principle, we have some implication here. So to justify this principle without referring to the welfare of the future children, to the individual, so harming and benefit, proponent of principle of procreative beneficence must propose an alternative reason to do something like that. What kind of reason is? This is the reason to create a world with more well-being. The moral aim is not to benefit or avoid harming, or at least not only, but rather to bring about a world, a state of affair, analyzing the outcome, with greater aggregate well-being. However, adopting this perspective is quite problematic. I don't have time to go into this kind of perspective. But I don't know if you are familiar with this kind of literature. This kind of perspective allows us to compare quantity and quality, leading us to the repugnant conclusion. So we are committed to accepting that a life with a variety of people, with a life barely worth living, is better than maybe a less, populated world with a higher well-being of the individual who lives in that world. Okay, but it's very complex. I don't want to go into this perspective. Second point is suggest that we have certain moral duty to reproduce because we have some, obligation to create this kind of greater, with a world with greater well-being. But what I find more convincing in this kind of reason, some might find it highly implausible unless assuming the existence of a deity that asks people to create well-being to be glorified, to have a moral obligation to create a world with greater well-being without this actually benefit anyone people. So I think that person is, or persons are a convincing grounding for secular ethics, okay? But if we, give up with referring to person, then we have some problem in justifying the need of creating a world with greater well-being, regardless people has been benefit or harmed. Why we should produce more well-being in person? What is the reason? So, I think that we should reject the impersonal approach, and along with this, we should reject the principle of procreative beneficence. Some authors, together along with me, have strongly rejected the impersonal perspective, instead advocating a person-affecting approach to procreative choices. Roughly speaking, According to the person-affecting approach, an action or an omission is morally relevant only if it benefits or harms a specific person, a recognizable individuality. That is, a person whose numerical identity, so this kind of union between oocyte and sperm, does not depend on the action taken. So, in light of this kind of assumption, proponents of this view limit to embracing less demanding procreative models, such as, in the context at least of IVF plus PGD, such as the minimal threshold model. According to the minimal threshold model, every reproductive choice is legitimate except bringing children into the world when there are good reasons to think that their quality of life will fall below an acceptable threshold. And this kind of threshold is often referred with the life worth not living threshold. Relatively rare cases, I think about Schneean, I think about Isaacs, rare cases that where extreme suffering completely outweighs any expected positive experience. In this case, so, recalling the thought experiment we had, not only is selecting embryos B or C indifferent, but also selecting embryo A with mutation M is indifferent, because we are providing a life worth living with the guy resulting from the embryo with condition M. The future individual developing from embryo A cannot be said to be harmed. M is a necessary condition for their existence. So there is no possible comparison between the possible words. So in the words of Rebecca Bennett, who is publishing a very interesting book about this thing with, I don't remember the editors or the publisher, but as long as we are choosing to create a worldwide lives, whether we choose a fetus who will be deaf, hearing, ugly, dyslexic, short, tall, highly intelligent, is not a moral choice, but just a preference. Do you remember the first slide when I asked you, is that a moral choice or just a preference deciding among the embryos? I think that the person-affecting perspective, in order to understand how procreative responsibility in the future, how can change, I think that is very relevant in my opinion. And I show you why. I think that person-affecting morality, as you can appreciate, has been mainly used in the selective context, IVF plus PGD, to support substantial procreative freedom. Basically, we are allowed to do whatever we want, except bringing a child with a life worth not living. And not to assert new moral obligation. On the contrary, in the remaining part of my presentation, I will try to show that even stemming from this theoretical background, in light of the future availability of reproductive genome editing and ectogenesis, we are still committed to supporting the existence of greater moral obligation for prospective parents. I call this perspective the greater moral obligation view. This will inaugurate an unprecedented change in procreative responsibility since the introduction of assisted reproductive technologies decades ago. Okay, so recall the future and still hypothetical application of reproductive genome editing. So, to human reproduction, so the possibility of modifying embryos prior the transfer into the uterus. Although at first glance we can notice some similarities between genome editing and PGD, someone could say, well, that's the reason why it's useless, right? Genome editing is useless. Both practices can be used in IVF to transfer embryo that will have some specific traits according to parent preference. PGD and RGE may be considered different from a moral standpoint. In the former, indeed, we are just selecting. So we are choosing the numerical identity. But in the latter, we are modifying. We are giving the same numerical identity a different genomic endowment. So let us suppose that the aforementioned couple, remember, are persuaded by the person-affecting argument I presented earlier and decide to randomly select which embryo to transfer into the uterus, and it turns out that they are about to transfer embryo A, the one with the condition M, or implant every embryo. However, suppose now that at the time of IVF, a genome editing treatment is now available that can safely, effectively, and affordably remove condition M. In this case, the future individual shares the same numerical identity as the embryo A. Therefore, the existence with M is no longer the only possibility. So it's no longer a necessary condition for the existence of embryo A and the future child produced by the embryo A. By choosing to select embryo A without modifying, the parents are not avoiding a comparative harm. Unlike the case of genetic selection, the future individual will be born into an unharmed condition in comparative terms that the parents could have avoided. And this can be considered a procreative genetic harm. So, more specifically, in light of this consideration, in light of assessment of this kind of comparison, we can now go to the question about what are the moral implications and what are the moral obligations now. Every time that the reproducers are about to transfer a specific human embryo that will develop into a person suffering from genetic disease that meet the following condition, we are obliged to basically perform genome editing. The following conditions are, they are such disease that, despite compatible with the life we're living, harm the child. Okay? So they are bad in a certain situation. Of course, badness is normative reflection, but here, stay with me about this. They are diseases for which, at the moment of IVF, safe treatment with RGE is available and legal, and it's not possible to treat them effectively in vitro or after the birth of the child. And this follow or this leads us to what has been called, or what can I be called, a mild restriction of procreative autonomy. According to the mild restriction of procreative autonomy, reproducers have a prima facie moral duty to transfer into the uterus an embryo without genetic disease that meet criteria A and B, only if they are already in the IVF process. That is, when in vitro embryos already exist, and if they want to have a child from one of those created embryos. Only in such cases it's sensible to speak of person affecting harm and benefit, and the existing embryo, which is designated to be transferred, could be modified to avoid genetic disease and disability. More specifically, we are required to not modify a designated embryo in order to have a child with a genetic disease or any condition that potentially harm the future child. B, to use RGE if the designated embryo has a harmful genetic disease that is curable via RGE treatment, and moreover, in the more distant future, parents to be should screen their embryos for potentially harmful condition treatable with RGE, so we are an extension of the use of genetic testing in embryos in the IVF process. Of course, this kind of clause faces a technical hurdle, as well as every kind of consideration, that we need, the technical feasibility to screen with PGD before RG application. A clarification very important here. This is mild restriction because I'm referring here to when this kind of obligation occurs. And we should notice here that this kind of restriction does not undermine the right to reproduce via sexual intercourse. Deciding reproducing either via IVF or sexual intercourse should lead or would lead to a different union between oocyte and sperm because, because of the time dependence view, the identity of the future individual would change in light of the time of reproduction because a different union between sperm and oocyte would occur. So the fact that I decided to go forward with IVF plus PGD or IVF plus RGE determined in the preconception scenario, the identity of the future child. However, our obligation would emerge after the creation of the embryos, after the fact that our identity of the future individual is already done. Okay? So we are referring to actual person there. Of course, we have some kind of implication and also some critiques on my arguments. But since I would like to do simple things, I don't want to address here. So if you want, then we can discuss in the Q&A time. And I would like just to finish my presentation with a further argument, noticing that my argument here can be considered as a consequence-based argument. We are just looking at the effect of our, how we can say, our obligation. However, there are a lot of people who believe that intentions, attitudes could play a moral role. So what I've done in the last part of the book is trying to apply some of this kind of reasoning, not only in a realm of morality according to which we have this kind of just consequence-based, okay, reason, but also we have non-consequence-based person-affecting morality reason. That is, what I would like to stress here is that for one that consider intention and attitudes something morally relevant, maybe we can say that an action or omission could be considered morally wrong if it is informed by defective attitudes, intention toward an actual person, and good if it is informed by good attitudes and intention toward an actual person. So here I'm referring compatible with a person affecting morality, some attitudes and intention that are directed toward a specific person. And in this perspective, I develop what some authors already discussed, but in a more refined way, the parent-child relationship argument, in order to argue that we may have even more reason to use genome editing and ectogenesis in some specific circumstances, even in the preconception scenario, not only in the post-conception one. This kind of reflection comes from recognizing that when we procreate, we intend not only to create a child, but to create a new relationship, also to parent a child. So we have, two different kind of desire here. The relationship places the parent, and the offspring in a form of mutual vulnerability, and this relationship must therefore be considered relevant in itself from a moral point of view. Creating a relationship binds us to the role of parents. So justify the fact that I have some obligation because I'm a parent. Okay? And therefore, to have certain attitudes, intention towards our children. And because of the fact we have this kind of obligation in the middle of a relationship, so when we have this kind of relationship with my current child, Chambers claim that we also have some obligation, and there is some moral relevance also in the beginning of this kind of relationship. And this can justify the fact that some, at least, parental attitudes and intention can have a role also in the context of procreation. Of course, this kind of argument may have implication also in the context of IVF and PGD. Only IVF and PGD are available. Maybe, preventing us to accepting this kind of bad implication according to which we should just letting people procreate without, considering even some suffering or some bad condition in the future child. But I'm not want to argue in this line. Here, I just want to stress that in the context of genome editing, intentions in light of the parent-child relationship reinforce the prescription of consequence-based person affecting that we already discussed in the post-conception context. So parents, there is, of course, some intention and attitude that prevent people to avoid to modify some embryo after the creation of this kind of embryos. However, what is important here is stressing the moral importance of attitudes and intention even in the context of preconception one. Okay? In the preconception where, remember, we don't have any kind of moral obligation from a consequence-based person affecting because our action modified the identity of the future children, right? However, in this context, things gonna change because parents' wish directed toward a specific child, so the future child, could be that created embryo, regardless of the initial genetic characteristic, developed in the best possible place to avoid suffering. Genome editing increases the possibility of parental control. So, the fact that we have, when a child is born, we have a lot of control, right? We can take care of it. If we decide to procreate with genome editing, we are expanding the room for having this kind of control. So if we expand in the room of having this kind of control, we are enhancing our procreative responsibility, but at the same time, we are also enhancing the parent-child relationship because we are manifesting more attitude of care, more attitude of protection toward the child. I am not choosing the child because of specific characteristic. I decided, regardless of the characteristic that the child could have, the embryo could have, I decided to protect the future child in the very beginning of my relationship. This kind of argument creates some reasons even in the preconception concept, not only in the post-conception one. Genome editing indeed increases the possibility of parental control over the characteristic of a specific future individual. Via genome editing, parents, as I said, would have more room to express attitudes of care and protection. The parent-child relationship is not only compromised here, not compromised, sorry, but even promoted and enhanced. This argument, and here finally I come with ectogenesis, as even more relevant in the context of ectogenesis. This technology indeed may allow treating the embryo or fetus in a safer way than invasive treatment, and without some balancing with, of course, legitimate the physical burdens of the women. In light of this, ectogenesis would be the ideal place to let your future children develop. Here we are enhancing again attitudes of protection and care. The choice to undergo this technique could promote the quality of the parent-child relationship. This could even be, the child could even be grateful in the light of this choice, although she could not be said to have been benefit from the specific choice, because of course we have the reflection we already discussed about the consequence-based perspective, but she could be grateful to have a parent who decided to take care of them from the very beginning of their relationship. So, in this perspective, although with, of course, less normative force, I have to say, we should not only be able to embrace the mild restriction of procreative autonomy, but also the bold restriction of procreative autonomy. Again, when I refer to bold and mild, I'm referring about when we have this kind of obligation, not the extent of this kind of obligation. There is no obligation to enhance their children here, for instance. From this perspective, all potential parents in the economic and technological condition to do so should encounter moral reasons to reproduce through the following practice. IVF, in order to employ RG to designate embryo whenever the latter is affected by treatable genetic disease that harm the future child, and wherever possible, ectogenesis, in order to employ treatment, genetic or otherwise, if the embryo is affected by condition potentially harmful for the future individual itself. So, I provided, I hope, strong argument in support of the greater moral obligation view. This will significantly extend the boundaries of procreative responsibility. This view appears to be broadly supported not only from a consequence-based perspective, but also from perspective that allows some roles, some moral roles, even in the context of attitudes and intentions, okay? So this is only, again, this view, okay? This is only a moral research, so please don't be scared about that. About prima facie reasons that can be balanced with other morally relevant things at stake in the context of reproduction that you are aware more than me. They are very complex context. And so legal and societal implications should be further discussed above this kind of reflection. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Davide, for this very lively and interesting presentation. Any questions from the audience? Remarks, reflections you had during the presentation?
I'm not a real ethicist, so let me start with a startup question before Pascal goes on. Thank you, Davide. Really interesting, I thought. I had I'm just recapturing what you tried to say. I think there is a difference in numerical identity and qualitative identity, and that is a source of your obligations towards your future child, I think. Then I was thinking, like, and that's related to that identity problem.
Mm-hmm.
How does that connect with the idea that you would only assign an identity to someone like 3 months after conception, so that the qualitative identity of the oocyte and the sperm cell itself is maybe an identity, but it's not a person yet? And is that, do you not mix up these things? And so can you actually speaking about harming something that is not yet a person? Am I right? Seeing it that way?
Thank you for the question. So there are a lot of reflection to do here. First, my argument is not committed to claiming that embryo has moral status, but is committed to claiming that we were embryos. Okay. So, according for some conception of identity, for instance, the animalist perspective, we could say that we are organisms, basically. So we are, member of the human species, and member of the human species does not have any kind of spatial moral consideration for all the time that are member of the human species. We can say that some member of the human species start being embryos without moral status, then they come up being a person because we are rationals or we experience pleasure and pain, whatever the criteria you want, and then maybe we end up not being anymore person in a moral sense. But this does not preclude the fact that we could be considered the same numerical identity, okay? If we consider the same numerical identity, so the fact that we are an organism with some genome that interact, and so that reproduce and replicate cells, and so on and so forth. And then, because of this, we can say that we were fetus, we were embryos, okay? From this perspective, we can say that we are not benefit the embryo or harming the embryo, we are benefit the future child. And since we are recognizing that embryo when we decided to transfer into the uterus, we are not only recognizing this kind of biological continuity that I try to discuss with you now, but also a moral continuity with the future child. So, of course, you could reply saying, well, this is not the only conception of identity we can address. There are a lot of identity conception. For instance, the identity conception according to which we are basically brain. And if we are basically brain, we cannot have being embryos or fetus, okay? This is the perspective provided by, for instance, Jeff McMahon, and so on and so forth. However, still in this perspective, Jeff McMahon is in favor of my argument because, of course, we cannot discuss about the identity, but we discuss about the characteristic necessary for the identity of the future children that could start at the third month or fourth month, and so on and so forth. So yes, again, there is a counter, this is a way to save my argument even in this kind of identity conception that you mentioned, but of course we can reject the identity conception that you mentioned, saying, well, I think that it seems to basically be in contrast with embryology, saying that we never been fetus or embryos, right? Of course, and this is basically the question about identity. This is a very interesting topic that nowadays is being discussed in literature about the the mix between the debate about moral status and the mix between and the debate about identity. I think that there are two different things, and we can speak of identity for being that are not yet person, but still be the same numerical identity of the person who will be created.
Okay, and that does not imply, how does that relate to abortion, say?
There is no, because if we consider the fact that embryo or fetus does not have moral status, and we attribute moral status only because we recognize that embryo, that fetus as the future child, so we have some obligation toward the future child, okay? then we have, of course, obligation. But if we refrain, if we give up with this kind of recognizing act, then, of course, we don't have moral obligation toward the future children because the future children does not ever exist.
Okay.
Thank you. And I would like to ask another question. Thanks, Davide, for your very engaging way of presenting and very knowledgeable of the topic. I have a question about something that you very often refer to, that you speak a lot about harm, you speak a lot about benefit as well, you refer to well-being, individual, you refer to aggregate well-being. How do we define those? Who is entitled to say that something is a harm or something is a benefit?
Nice, thank you. Very philosophical question to say today.
Didn't expect that from you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Pascal. Very right and fascinating question. So I spent the second chapter of the book trying to understanding with what is the right definition of disability. Consider the fact that disability can be considered a harm, and we have some reason to prevent it. Then, of course, we need some definition of disability in order to understand what is worse off or what is bad, okay? What is okay and what is good, right? So there are different kind of definition of disability. So there is the medical definition of disability that tend to consider disability basically superimposable to an impairment, or a social one that consider, well, there is no difference actually, that this is the mere difference view. So there is no difference actually in our capabilities, but it's basically up to the society defining what are is and what are not is. So I'm basically like racism or, or sexism. We are basically discriminating people with some specific characteristic, okay? However, there are, of course, different kind of definitions, the welfarist one and the equal opportunity model definitions. There are two convincing, in my opinion, definitions and two different kind of definition that one focus more on the welfare and well-being, so providing some kind of suffering, right? That is the perspective provided by Julian Savulescu and Guy Kahn in 2009 and 2011. And the other one I prefer is the equal opportunity one. The fact that when we look at health, what is important is trying to preserve a sort of functioning, because in that way we are providing or promoting some equal opportunities. And so these kind of traits that prevent me to have a reasonable range of opportunities, that could have a person without apparent strong disability when she or he is alive, then we have some reason to avoid this kind of disability, and so considering this as a bad. But I go on further with you, saying, well, okay, assuming that it's very difficult to, assuming a very relativistic perspective about, well, what is harm, what is benefit, who knows? Every kind of people has different kind of perspective. Yes, we can say like that. Okay, I can buy it. However, we can say that maybe you have to be committed what I call a consistency argument. Whenever you are about to treat an existing child for some diseases, that it's your responsibility to deciding, for instance, treatment or not, or having some treatment or having or not, or sending the child to school or not, okay? The same standard should be applied even in the context of genome editing. So this kind of perspective can be applied even from a very subjectivistic perspective. However, what is required to the parent is that he or she should be consistent with the treatment of the child in the when she or he is alive and when he or she is basically an embryo.
But can I add something, because you very focus much about existing or not existing and the harm of that, but the fact that you make an assumption that it's very relevant, to do a fetal screening or an embryo screening in order to identify risks, because that's important. My point is like, well, maybe we do more harm by doing this screening, because every embryo, you will identify risks, every embryo. So what you don't do is to, if you think this through, is that you will have to select in the end an embryo, the best one, let's assume. But this means that you will know all kinds of risks of all the individuals. This will have an impact on the relationship with a child. This will have an impact on the identity of the person. This will have a societal impact as well. And these are elements, I think, that are not really being integrated in the model that you develop, which are not related to selecting one embryo above the other one. This has to do with the fact that the one you choose will suffer potentially harm as well of the fact that it's being selected.
What do you mean with the fact that it's being selected? Because existing is providing us suffering?
For sure, yeah, because as a consequence of
yes,
I mean, there is, we know as one of the principles that is being accepted is the right not to know. You are infringing the right not to know.
Yeah, but the right not to know can be infringed when there is some morally compelling reason to, to undermine it, right? Okay,
it's not an absolute, but it's as well, it's a prima facie principle.
Yeah, indeed, we have some balancing here, right? So who knows what is there? But I would like to add something about the fact that when we're selecting an embryo, we are, making the future child, more risky to be suffering or not. Of course, life is suffering, life is struggle. But yes, of course, we should have some act at least when we have some reasonable expectation here. It's not about the actual risk, but it's about a reasonable expectation. Of course, in chapter 4, I also discussed this kind of if being alive is a benefit or not. This could be very relevant for our discussion. I think that it is a benefit. I'm quite happy to be alive, even though I have some hearing problem, even though, I have not so good salary, and I'm struggling a lot in my life, but, I'm quite happy, of course. So what is important, and this is the, the distinction between life worth living and life not living, having some room for experiencing even something good. Thank you for your philosophical question. So appreciated.
We have one more question also.
Okay. I wanted to ask something regarding just about the end of your presentation.
Okay.
You say that all potential parents in the economic and technological conditions to do so should encounter more reason to reproduce through the following practices, and you describe it. But I wonder if you take into consideration the fact that in reality the people that would be able to access this kind of technologies are people that are from a middle to high income and societal status. And the thing is that the expressivist objection might have some basis in the sense that if mainly people that are from higher developed countries or are wealthier, they can access these kind of technologies, then even if they go through these moral reflections and such, the result will be, in fact, that people of that kind of status will be able to access these technologies and in a way could exacerbate some inequalities that already exist. So, for example, of course, people that are less wealthy will have more problems, and that with taking care of a person with a disability, but for a person that instead has is more wealthy, having the same disability in that context could not be regarded as a disability. So for me, it's a bit interesting to see what's your take on this.
Nice. Thank you for your brilliant questions. Yes, some society could be considered disability in a different way, because they refer to what has been called the dominant cooperative framework. Each society has this kind of dominant cooperative framework, and I quite, happy to say that disability should rely on this notion. So we can have some different kind of obligation depending of the society in which we are.